Wants and Needs by Toby Bennett. Once upon a time there was a boy. He slept too near the window and the monsters got him before his story really began. After him there was a girl. She knew to check under the bed and never left the window open when she slept. That worked pretty well until her doll smothered her one night. Everyone said it was asthma, and none of it would have happened if the window were open. No one asked why the back of the doll's dress was torn. Anyway, if she had opened the window, something else would have got her. Trust me, there are monsters everywhere. They come in all shapes and sizes, and the reason you can't see them is that you can't even see the one staring back at you from the mirror. Nobody used the room for a few years after the little girl died, and the monsters got old or fat, or so thin you could barely see them. The vampires chittered and hung upside down in the closet. The werewolves withered to dust bunnies. Goblins squabbled over the last scraps of the boy, and the red-eyed owls were silent almost every night. With not one scream in 5 years on which to feed, they began to die, as monsters always die, of loneliness. One monster in particular was beginning to suffer, the Griven. Now Grivens are rare as monsters go, and unfortunate among their kind because they are, by and large, what humans regard as cute. Few first-time observers notice the wicked stinger on the end of their tails, or the retractable claws that tip clever pink fingers. Even the usually fatal sight of a Griven's flared emerald neck feathers only brings the victim closer to get a proper look, which of course is just how nature and just a bit of magic has designed it. Grivens always have at least one human feature. This is because whenever they eat their victim, they take on some of their shape and stature. They start off looking something like a cross between a lizard and a bird. They are sometimes even confused with a cockatrice if they are very young and not particularly colourful, and change a little whenever they feed. So ironically, the overly large ears or the appealingly large eyes that draw the next victim in are usually borrowed from past meals. There are even legends that say some of the oldest and nastiest Grivens ended up looking almost entirely human, except for their tails and feathery neck. So if you take my advice, you'll never trust someone wearing a collar and tie. This particular Griven was called Jom, and the only thing human about him was the strong Roman nose that jutted out over his small but fang-filled mouth. The nose's former owner would no doubt be shocked at the amount of mucus it is producing at the moment. The Roman he'd taken it from had been a bit of a stoic. To tell the truth, the nose isn't the only thing that we might regard as human about Jom. The crying should be a hint to a keen observer. Yes, Jom was in love, unrequited and miserable love. The object of his affection was already disappearing down the road at a good pace provided by a merry skip, her blonde pigtails bobbing. A pair of shoes in one hand, and in the other a magnifying glass winking coyly in the sun. Oh, how wicked that little piece of glass had been! The smouldering remains of the earthworms on the sun-softened pavement were all that remained of her conquest, but the memories they evoked were almost enough to dry Jom's tears. Almost, but then the thought that the fun was over for the day and that he would have to wait until tomorrow, or even the day after, to see his petite love again, renewed the waterworks. Jom had been watching his love for almost a month now, ever since he had noticed her hunting in the overgrown garden beneath his window. She had taken her shoes off that first day, and Jom had been mesmerized by the sight of her dainty toes sliding through the dark, damp earth of the garden. It had rained the entire afternoon, so she'd had to be content with drowning the worms, along with a mouse she'd brought along from somewhere in a jam jar. Petty acts of cruelty in the greater scheme of things. Certainly not something that should have excited a creature prepared to rip your head off to borrow your ears, but something about the little girl had struck a chord in Jom. The way she'd stood there unsullied from the feet up, an angelic smile her mother would never see through spread across her flawless face, all the while pushing the desperate mouse from the side of the barrel with a stick. Occasionally she'd let the mouse grip the stick, pulling it free of the filthy rainwater before plunging it right down to the bottom of the barrel and forcing one more frantic ascent from the helpless creature. At last it had lost the strength to swim, and she'd lost interest. The rodent bobbed just beneath the surface, its lungs filling with water until it was heavy enough to sink, then sank. Her delightful little pout as she'd prodded at the dead thing beneath the water with her stick had almost taken Jom's own breath away. He'd known then that he loved her. He'd felt a stirring from the first. But this was true love. After all, who could not love anything so innocent, so cruel? He wasn't sure whether he loved the part of her that hated, or the part that felt nothing at all, and in the end he decided it didn't really matter. As the days went by, she came back again and again, and with ever more spite in her dead eyes. He realized he'd found the perfect monster. But how to approach her? She was still young and mostly human. If he scared her, she might never come back, and he might lose even the vicarious pleasure he derived from watching her at play. For the rest of the day, the Griffin paced the room, racked by indecision. His tail flicked idly as he pondered what to do. Perhaps if he left a dead cat in the garden, or even a live one for her to play with, maybe something bloody and unrecognizable. With a monster of her sort, the only sure way to lure it would be presence and curiosity. Jom knew just the one to help him in that regard. If only he could be sure she wouldn't harm the child, and that was a big if, because the one he had in mind had quite a temper. Still, nothing ventured, nothing gained, he eventually decided. He wiped his nose for the 100th time and prepared to venture forth. Besides, the little dancer might be in a good mood, Jom reassured himself as he stepped carefully over the snarling dust bunnies and made his way down into the dilapidated main hall of the house. The tiny eyes of the carved naked figures surrounding the old broken mirror that reflected a different murder every midnight followed him as he scuttled down the landing. Occasionally a shadow detached itself from the wall to take an idle swipe at him, but none ever really had a chance to catch the nimble Griffin. They just knew he would feel bad if they didn't try. The sounds from the hallway closet told of the skeletons playing dice, in a game where losing your shirt was the least of your worries. With the werewolf so hungry at the moment, there were lots of bone men in the market for a replacement limb. Down in the kitchen, the slime from the tap was oozing closer to a careless rat. Without eyes, the slime couldn't see the bendy straw the rat held beneath its body, or the ruddy winks of its hungry compatriot's eyes under the sink. The Griffin's pointed ears swiveled as he listened to the other rooms in the house. Just as he'd expected, his quarry was in the music room. The dull tinkle of the rusted music box led him down into the almost total darkness in which the dancer lived. As Jom approached the room, he could hear her porcelain shoes tapping out a beat beneath the half-collapsed piano. He crept closer to the grimy doorway and peered through. The dancer's dress was almost as ragged as the velvet curtains over the window that turned the last light of the dying sun into thin streaks of amber. This alternately illuminated and hid the tiny dancer. Minute motes of dust stirred by her passing swirled up in the narrow shafts of fading light, making it seem as if she vanished in an explosion of stars before reappearing in the next oasis of light. Jom had once had a lair in a theatre, and he knew the look of someone who loved the spotlight. But the dishevelled creature was not suitable for any audience. It was all a farce played for the shadows, a parody of a true performance. The whole scene was made ridiculous by the slow tinkle of the music box's mechanically challenged waltz, and the fact that the frantic dancer stood only 12 inches in height. Despite his urge to laugh, the Griffin sat back on his haunches and watched the doll with the torn-back dance in respectful silence. At last she noticed him and turned a haphazardly repainted face on her visitor. Although the doll was incapable of conveying emotions with her fixed expression, the jagged crack running from one missing eye to her chin gave the impression of a malevolent hatred that made Jom question the wisdom of eliciting her aid. But he knew her weakness. She was a slave to her emotions as much as Jom. If the little girl who had once owned the doll hadn't dropped the dancer and marred her beauty, she might still be alive. Jom had come prepared to indulge that vanity. Before the doll could reach for the stiletto she kept hidden near the music box, he held out his offering. The doll stopped at the sight of the tiny blue dress, a doll's dress, clean and almost new. The Griffin had taken it from the small collection of dolls and toys the object of his affection had stolen from her friends and stockpiled in a dry corner of the old coal shed. Unable to speak, the doll simply snatched its new dress and skittered back. As soon as she was sure she had reached a safe distance, she tilted her head and raised a shoulder, silently asking what he wanted. Jom took a deep breath and began to tell her of his problems. He begged and promised and threatened until at last the doll nodded. Jom hardly slept that night, a fact for which many of the more sensitive monsters in the house were grateful, given the size and resonance of Jom's nose. There wasn't even so much as a single snore. Instead, Jom stared out on the moonlit garden and imagined his love once again at play. He remembered the time she'd found the grass snake and mashed it into small pieces from the tail up, or the time she'd pushed her little brother onto a broken bottle and wept crocodile tears as she'd helped him stagger home. He wondered if she would scream when she saw him, or if she would feel as he did. Jom had lived long enough not to believe in love at first sight, but not quite long enough to give up on the idea that love would prevail. The one who had hatched him had told him that love was like mold. It grew on you unless you scraped it off regularly. So it would be with his own love once she'd seen the bond between them. Even if it took some time, she had to. Those were the rules. Besides, it was too late now. The doll was already lying in the front hallway, just visible through the half-open front door. If he didn't stake his claim on the girl now, the doll would have her, or something else would. The werewolves were no doubt sick of old bones. All night he watched the garden. He hardly noticed the leaves turn from grey to green in the growing light. The vampires came home, thin as ever, miserable and hungry, no matter who they had eaten. The red-eyed owls rested their bloodshot orbs in the old tower, and predators of a different kind wrapped themselves in suits, preparing to hide their claws in another day of comfortable handshakes and practiced smiles wide enough to hide their fangs. Through the morning Jom waited, and the air got hotter and thicker. Lazy bees scoured the undergrowth before returning to their recently repaired nests. New worries assailed Jom. What if she didn't come today? Had he wasted the blue dress? The doll would not wait another night. Unconsciously, Jom started flicking his claws in and out and gnawing on his favourite parts of the windowsill. Just as he had all but lost hope, she appeared, an old spade in one hand and a box in the other. Jom leaned forward, eyes wide, willing her to hurry up. She fiddled with the old latch, and Jom bit down on the woodwork in frustration. His love leaned back into the street, making sure she was not observed, and Jom tore lines into the old wall with his claws. She had to know how she was teasing him. Come on, come on! Only the wood in his mouth stifled the hoots of need. She opened the noisy gate. She opens the noisy gate and slinks in. Her head is still hurting from her mother's attention to her hair. The trespasser stops to unlace her shiny black leather shoes. She does this not just because the garden is dusty and liable to ruin the shine, but also because she craves the feel of dirt against her feet. She'd have to be careful today. Today she plans to dig. It will feel good to get at the cooler dirt from under the baked surface of the yard, but she can't let it mark her where others might see. There is a good spot for digging near the corner of the house. Best to dig in the shade. She can't afford to sweat. That will mar her just as much as dirt above the ankle. In the box, her brother's hamster still makes an examination of its prison, as it has been doing for the last 6 blocks. Soon it will start to gnaw, but if she finishes the hole before it gets out, then that probably won't do it much good. Either way, her brother won't be happy, and that will be entertainment enough. The girl stops suddenly when she realizes the front door of the house is open. She looks around nervously, wondering if anyone is watching. Some part of her hoping someone is. Her curiosity flares into anger as she notices the bright blue fabric just inside the doorway. She recognizes it because she stole it from Sally Fivers. Stole it fair and square as far as she was concerned. It doesn't matter who violated her sanctuary or why, they are going to pay. She lets the box fall, spilling the hamster into the yellow grass, too incensed to worry about the loss. She grips the shovel in both hands and advances on the open door. Angrily, she bats aside the creaky door and makes her way into the thick-smelling gloom inside the house. She bends to pick up the doll, but before she reaches it, it stands up of its own accord and scampers away from her. The girl frowns and takes a step back. The doll stops and turns, daring her to follow. Rage welled in the girl. It wasn't right, her beautiful dress stolen by such an ugly old thing. She feels the weight of the shovel in her hand. One little pest would be as easy to bury as another, and she will have her property back. She snatches for her tormentor, but the doll pirouettes and darts down the hall. Too enraged to be cautious, she follows. The girl chases the doll deeper into the house to a room with torn curtains where a broken music box clicks out a metallic tune. The girl enters the room, shovel held high, screaming her hatred. But instead of the doll, she finds something different. Laid out in a jagged sunbeam is a radiant lizard. No, not a lizard, she realizes as she looks at it closer. But it does have scaly skin. Colours of almost every hue wink at her from its smooth hide, and around its neck a crest of feathers that would put a peacock to shame is unfurling, blooming like some flower in one of those speeded-up nature films they showed at school. Most incredible of all is the broad pink nose that sticks out over the creature's wide, tooth-filled smile. She laughs even though she can't quite understand why she is laughing, her anger almost entirely forgotten. Jom stared up at his love, with something close to magic radiating from him. He was quickly becoming lost in her eyes, and found himself purring at the heat of the fading bloodlust in them. He raised himself up to his full height, only half aware that his crest was swelling. He writhed his sinuous body to the clinking music, as much a dancer now as the doll who watched with one unblinking eye from the corner. He knew he had to get closer. His love felt it too, he could tell. She took one step towards him, then another, as lost as Jom in the moment. Her foot snagged on a splintered floorboard, but the girl came on regardless, trailing tiny crimson drops through the dust and twilight. Jom stiffened at the sweet smell. His legs bunched beneath him. She took one last step. They were nearly together, two monsters writhing in time with the music. Before he knew quite what he was doing, the Griffin pounced. In his defense, it was as much instinct as intent. But as Jom reflected to himself while staring down at his pretty new feet and their 10 perfectly pink little toes, the trouble with being a monster is that you never know love from hunger.